Morning, everyone. How's the sound?
Good. Yep.
Great.
Very good.
Okay. I got hit by a wave of the yawns, and I hope the stimulation of being watched, being looked at, gives me my second wind here. I tried to caffeinate myself thoroughly, and now I just have the yawns and an eyebrow twitch. So I find that when I try to improve my situation, I don't. Um, and that's kind of the theme of the day that I'm curious to talk about. I um, When I suggested the theme of the talk, I didn't anticipate that it was going to be Easter. It's Easter, right? Today's Easter Sunday. Yeah. So this is a gauge of uh, how Christian everybody's families are, or how close you are to your Christian family. Yeah, or aren't. Or when lunch is, maybe lunch is just later and you have the morning free. Um, But is anyone here for the first time or back after a while away? No. Okay. Great. Um, because some of the things I want to talk about, if you were coming for the first time and you wanted to be given like a lot of hope, it might be a little bit discouraging, you know. Um, but you know, I had a friend that was a Christian, that is a Christian pastor, and he was asked to give the homily on Easter Sunday. And that's kind of like an honor at his church. The elders are like, we want you to give a homily for the Easter Sunday. And he's like, well, I don't really believe in the resurrection. And they're like, yeesh, okay. And you have to figure out what the pivot's going to be there. And then it's kind of like, okay, so what's being a Christian for you if you don't believe in the resurrection? And what does the story of the resurrection mean to you if you don't take it literally? And a lot of times, a lot of us in like kind of what we call like Western meditation-based convert communities to Buddhism, we can kind of pride ourselves on having a very rational approach to spirituality. Um, or like kind of a no nonsense. There's not Zen's kind of beyond the myths and dogmas and stuff like that. When you start to spend some time with this stuff, you get to find out that ain't quite the case. It's just kind of Zen was repackaged for export, and had some of the elements that Western audiences find unsavory removed, kind of like how you can get mild butter chicken at Jaipur. Um, and And I wanted to take a look at that because I think a lot of our kind of first generation of Western teachers in the middle of the 20th century really believed that what they were offering us and what they were interpreting was like old school, authentic, old-fashioned Zen Buddhism, you know, in accord with the lineage, in accord with the way it's always been practiced. And if we kind of look at history and read religious studies and ethnographic, understandings of how Buddhism was shaped in the modern era, we come to find that actually the Zen that we've encountered is kind of a recent development. It's kind of various types of reform movements took place after the Meiji period, which is the late 1800s, that kind of repackaged Buddhism and really repackaged Buddhism in the lens of what was palatable in the kind of Western scientific materialist world, because even though Japan was never colonized, it lived under the shadow of the expanding influence of the kind of Eurocentric, Anglo-centric, American-centric colonial project. And one of the hallmarks of that is kind of Protestantism and scientific materialism. You know, so, so if the Buddhist traditions that were under threat of colonization or that had to demonstrate their value, demonstrate their philosophical worth and coherency to a Western audience, had to figure out how to emphasize the aspects that were palatable and de-emphasize the aspects that weren't. And to this day, you see, once you kind of have your eye opened up to this, you start to see how pervasive it can be, you know. Uh, like practices that are ritualistic, devotional practices, worshipful practices. In Western Zen centers, we call them forms, as if they were etiquette, as if it was manners. You know, we hold our hands like this because it's the form. We put our hands like this because it's the form. We do a prostration because it's the form. We've reduced the devotional act of prostrating yourself as if it was like walking with a book on your head. This is the manner, this is the etiquette of the Zendo, you know, and we're cutting ourselves off from something that's a historically pretty integral part of the tradition. Um, so I think it's okay. It's kind of like if you tried to skip to cursive, if you tried to skip to writing cursive, I don't know if they even teach cursive anymore, but you know, in the first grade, I learned how to print. In the second grade, I learned how to print, and we started putting little curly cues at the end of all of the letters to kind of get us ready for cursive. And then in the third grade, we started doing cursive, you know. And we had that special paper that had two solid lines and then one dotted line in the middle. So you learned how to make your small a's small and your large a's large and stuff. And and then once you've learned all that and you've gone through the paces, then your cursive can be very interpretive and you can figure out how do I want to write? You know, but if you never learn how to print, if you don't learn the alphabet and you try to skip to doing cursive, it's gibberish, you know? And so if we're going to make decisions about the practice that we want to do and what we what matters to us, I think we owe it to the tradition, owe it to the spiritual our spiritual ancestors, and owe it to ourselves to do our due diligence to figure out what are our assumptions coming into this and what are we throwing away and what are we believing, you know? Believing that we're not believing things, what are we believing? You know, like what's the view that seems so straightforward that is actually kind of a recent development. Um, so there's this interesting thing. Has everybody heard of I may have mentioned this at one point in a previous talk, but ISKCON, International Society of Krishna Consciousness. This is a movement that began, yeah, is an organization, it's a specific organization that is a certain representation of an somewhat old Indian tradition called Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is basically the worship of Vishnu by way of Krishna. You know, so sometimes they're popularly called the Hare Krishnas. This is a religious phenomenon, kind of a new religious movement that began in New York in the 60s, founded by an Indian teacher that came from India to New York. And for a long while, the Indian teacher was the only Indian person involved, and he was representing this whole culture as one person to all of these white converts. You know, and all these white converts that are coming to this practice by way of the Grateful Dead and LSD and you know Allen Ginsberg and what have you, you know, and then they find this George Harrison among them, um, and and for a good long time they got to kind of really kind of buy into the myth of what it meant for them to be like yogis studying under this guru. You know, it's a really kind of storybook rendition of what they're doing. This kind of, I'm a disciple, I'm a devotee, I'm a yogi, and I'm studying this unique thing under this very rare master, you know? And it's interesting how a lot of the like missionaries that came to America all had in common that they were these very, very unique masters. So in Japan, there's, you know, might be 12,000 Zen priests, you know, or something like that, or more. And then, but the ones that came to the US were they were the real masters. You know, the four that came to the US we're lucky we got the four best ones out of Japan. You know, it's interesting. It's an interesting thing, the way we write our histories, you know, the myths that we tell ourselves, Suzuki Roshi was the best. Category Roshi was the best. No one was like them. Them coming here is proof that they were better than the other ones that didn't come. So Srila Prabhupada from India was like the best representative of this, and he just happened to be our guru. And then in the 70s and 80s, when there was kind of a surge in South Asian immigration, um, and South Asian immigrants, Indian immigrants, were finding these Hare Krishna temples as, sometimes you move to like, say you move to Omaha and there's not a huge Indian population, but there's a Hare Krishna temple. We're like, this is the closest thing to Indian culture. This is the closest thing to Hinduism I'm going to get. So I go to the Hare Krishna temple. And then slowly, slowly, all the white devotees that really had this kind of wistful understanding of what they were doing, they're looking around, they're like, oh shit, this is just church. I've been doing church for 20 years, thinking I was a devotee of a rare and special guru. And I think at some point, a lot of in the Zen world, there's a reckoning that we're going to have to go through, that really it's a religion just like anything else, you know, and the value of it is what kind of conversation does it help you initiate with yourself in your life, you know? I don't think there's such a thing. There's this, I forget his name, Robert Wright or something, wrote this yellow book that was a New York Times bestseller called Why Buddhism is True. You know, uh, it feels like a very American approach to understanding religion. Buddhism's true if it works for you. If you have a theistic orientation, if the Quran unlocks some kind of conversation that you're going to have with yourself, or if the Gospels unlock some kind of conversation that you need to have with yourself, or your relationship to your rabbi unlocks some kind of conversation that you need to have with yourself and helps you manifest the life that you want to live and give it meaning, that's true. And if you come to a Zen center and you try to sit still and it's a shit show for you, then Buddhism's not true for you, you know, unless that hook sets. And if the hook sets and it begins a wholesome, helpful dialogue, then Buddhism's true for you. It's all contingent. Nothing's true from its own side. These are all encounters that we're going to have. This is a dialogue that's happening. So what do we believe about what Buddhism's going to do for us? You know, if we read the books, we have this idea that there's this thing called enlightenment. And there's a technique, you know, and techniques are proven and systematic and followable, and consistent. And there's a technique that you can follow, and if you do it, and if you really have your shit together and do it appropriately, then you get to have the enlightenment thing. And the enlightenment thing is this top-down experience, which is going to just restructure the way that you relate to everything because you're going to understand what the truth is. There's this thing called the truth, and you're going to understand what it is if you play your cards right, and it's going to rewrite everything for you. All of your idiosyncrasies, all of your frustrations, all the ways that you don't get along with people, all the aversions that you have, you're not gonna have them anymore because you're gonna see the truth and it's gonna restructure the way that you relate to everything. How does that sound when you hear it said out loud? If you had a Christian friend, a Muslim friend, a Jewish friend, a yoga practitioner friend that said, there's this thing that if you do it right, would you think that sounded reasonable? If you heard a Christian friend say, well, if you pray right and you get the blessings from God, then it actually rewrites everything and it takes care of it from the top down. And you're like, well, what about should you go to therapy? Should you take your meds? Should you try to stop drinking? Should and it's like, no, no, no. If I play my cards right, I'll commune with the divine and it's going to set me straight. It sounds kind of stupid, right? I think it does. And so are we being stupid? To what extent do we really buy in to this idea that there's a specific experience that you're going to have that's going to reprogram your relationship to reality? You know? And I know a lot of folks, and I was there. If it's like it's like this session might be the one. This session might be the one where I have this experience. Or if I go do 90 days, then I'm just increasing the odds. If I go to Japan and do 3 years, I'm just increasing the odds. This is going to be the one. And there's a strain of practice that was sold to Westerners, um, that was really, really influential in a lot of the schools of Buddhism that are practiced in the West. And they kind of presented the koan curriculum as this thing that you could kind of rapidly move through. And you don't have to do any other study. You don't have to study Buddhism psychology. You don't have to study the Madhyamaka school, the Yogacara. You don't have to know anything about the epistemology or any of the texts, like all Buddhist experts had to do for all time. But all of a sudden, now that the West is interested, there's this thing that you can do called the koan curriculum, and you can move through it, and you don't have to study anything else. And it's gonna reprogram you, you know? And it's dying, and a lot of times the Western teachers or even the Japanese teachers that are teaching in America in the 60s, 70s, they're like, Zen is dying in Japan. It's just a hollow shell of itself. And the real spirit of practice is this meditation practice that you can do, you know? And we know what we're like, we know what capitalist consumerist, uh uh you know, uh, self-important Americans are like. They're like, yeah, I can do this. Somehow all of Japan lost the plot, but have a BA in philosophy, and I'm gonna go to a session, and this teacher says I might be able to do that. I might be able to have a kensho during this session, and it became a form in mid-century, Zen, that like people were going to do retreats, and the teacher would say 3 people had kensho during this retreat. You know, where did they all go? What happened to them? You know, there were so many of them. What happened to their lives? Did it restructure them? Did it reprogram it? Did it sort them out? You know. Um, so how much do we need to wake up and how much do we need to grow up? You and what's involved in growing up? Now, we can hear this my kind of trying to make fun of the notion of enlightenment, trying to make fun of the notion of the once and for all transhistorical kensho that rewrites your personality. And then you could get pessimistic. You can have resignation. You could be like, well, then this thing doesn't have anything to offer if it doesn't have that to offer. And there's no such thing as awakening. All the stories throughout all the koan stories and all the stories of Buddha are just this kind of, religious myth, you know. And you're welcome to do that if you want. But I think what would be more interesting would be to like, okay, so then what is it about? What is enlightenment? You know, what what is liberative? If it's not my fantasy of transcendence, then what is liberation actually like? You know, is the whole concept of liberation in the domicile of bondage? Is the whole concept of freedom in the domicile of non-freedom? Is it just this, like sometimes we think about healing so that what? Healing so that we are repaired so that we can get torn apart again by the powers that be. You my friend Geshen once said, the wellness industry is capitalism trying to sell you back the well-being that it's already robbed from you, so it can take it, so it can refuel and get it again. You know. So, what kind of conversation does practice help us begin to have with ourselves? You know, if I'm not trying to have a certain experience, what am I doing? I don't know. Sometimes I could talk about what Zazen is and I could make a very compelling argument, you know? And sometimes I could leave people feeling kind of like they have wind in their sails for doing this stuff. Sometimes I say that I somehow stumble upon the right phrase and I hear people, you know, see people nod and hear people gasp. And sometimes I'm like, I don't know what we're doing. I don't know what we're doing. But I think we're trying to have an open-hearted encounter with our own life situation, you know? By sitting still and letting it all land and not trying to fix anything and to just see who's home. Take some time to see who's home. Take some time to feel what's happening without trying to run interference on reality all the time. You know, when I yawn, I reach for coffee, you know, and I'm shortchanging myself from the experience of seeing what the arc of energy it could be for me, with the arc of a yawn, you know, with the arc of the rhythms of myself. When I get bored and I respond to boredom by figuring out how to stimulate myself, I'm turning away from an interaction with the plain felt experience of being alive. I'm saying I'm actually not interested in that. I think being alive is a gift. I can say that. I've read enough books to know that I want to say that. I saw that episode of Oprah. I think being alive is a gift. Okay, good. But when I'm bored, I want to do something about it, you know? So you're being given the gift of the felt experience of being alive, and it's not satisfying a part of you. It's not scratching that itch, you know? So you add something to it. You try to pivot. You try to augment. You try to adorn your experience some way, And Zazen is saying, if I really want to live this one life, having lived this one life, I want to feel what it's like to live this one life. And I want to receive the gift that I'm being given instead of trying to adorn it, trying to augment it, turning away from it. Can I handle saying, I'm going to spend 40 minutes feeling the felt experience of what it's like to exist? And I'm not doing it for Kensho and I'm not doing it for enlightenment. I'm not even doing it to become a better person. I'm doing it to receive my life. And it's like, well, what's it about? What's it for? I remember one time, my first summer at the monastery I lived at, Tassajara, we had a tea ceremony. There was the person that was the head of practice there was also a tea sensei. So we did the full Japanese tea ceremony, which is like the most etiquette. It's the most arduous half an hour to drink 3 sips of drink that you'll ever have in your life. And there's a way to do everything, and you got to bow and you got to turn the cup 3 ways. And someone was there and they said, "So what's this for? What does this have to do with your practice? Is this a mindfulness exercise?" You know, um, and the tea teacher goes, "It's about having tea." You know, so how have we been trained? What are the forces working in our life? How has our mind been shaped so that we're thinking, what is this for? What are we playing at here? What are we getting to? Where's the reward? What am I going to get? You know, if you sit zazen, you get to have sat zazen, and you get to turn away from the need of stimulation, and you're habituating yourself. Okay, so let's not pretend like there's no benefits. All right, I can play that kind of card, but then if I want to, speak to another aspect of it, a lifetime of doing this can really assuage the preoccupation with gratification. Imagine if you felt gratified by existing. Imagine if your flight got delayed and you're going to be in the airport, and especially y'all's airport has very little going on. There's like one place to eat. It's like Ducky Sam's or something like that, and they just have curly fries or whatever. Um, and you're stuck there, and you're going to be there for 6 hours or something like that, and you go like, okay, good, cool. I get to no one's calling me, no one's going to ask anything of me. I don't have to work, I don't have to perform, and I get to just really just be here, and how do we think? Well, good. Then what's the Wi-Fi password? I'm gonna watch movies. I'm gonna watch last night's SNL. What book am I gonna listen to? You know, what music am I gonna listen to so I can have a nice time? You know, I know that I think this life is a gift, but in order for me to experience this gift, I have to augment the felt experience of existing. It's a very interesting place where we've ended up. When I think about my happiest memories, uh, they weren't movies I was watching, you know, um, and they weren't records I was listening to, you know. They were light on leaves and conversations, you know. They weren't even meals I had. It was the smell of the wet pavement on the schoolyard on a rainy day. Yeah. So we're dialing in to the subtleties of existence. Now, I want to get back on topic though here. There's a lot of transformation that can happen with engaging this tradition. And I've never seen it solve everybody's problems. I've met people that have passed every koan. I've met people that have lived in the monastery for 30 years. I've met people who have written all the books. I've traveled to Japan to study with the best teacher in Japan, you know. Um, I've been on the stage with the Dalai Lama. Um, there's something wrong with everyone, you know? And and a good teacher is gonna hopefully have their finger on the pulse of what's wrong with them and know how to work with it, you know. The most dangerous ones are the ones that have been surrounded by people that are telling them there's nothing wrong with them, and are really bought into the myth. I think in the beginning of Dune, there's this line, everyone should have a sense of the sardonic in themselves, sense of the sardonic. You gotta have an open-hearted relationship with your limitations. Yeah. I remember watching an interview, or there was a conference where the Dalai Lama was speaking, and they were talking about ordination of nuns. Because throughout a lot of Buddhist Asia, nuns aren't allowed to get full ordination. Um, and the reason being that the lineage has died out. You got to have a quorum of four nuns to make a new nun, and in all these countries, there aren't four nuns, so you can't make a new nun. You know, and it's like, well, in Taiwan they have four nuns. It's like, but that's a different lineage. That doesn't count. That's not four nuns of our tradition. So there's this conference where they're bringing this up to the Buddha or to the Dalai Lama, and he goes, I have every belief that if Shakyamuni Buddha was here, he would approve of the ordination of nuns. And everybody starts applauding, and they're like, cool, this is the next thing he's gonna say is like, therefore we're gonna do it. And the next thing he says, but Shakyamuni Buddha's not here. You know, this guy's the best of the best, right? He's the culmination of what this tradition has to offer. How could he have any blind spots? You know, my teacher, I my teacher was I thought he was brilliant, and he really I felt so loved. And there's so many people that had this account of him where Kosha really opened my heart, you know. And late in his life, he's still alive. Um, yeah, I think he's nonverbal now, but he's still alive. But towards the end, he was the abbot of a Zen center, and he just like falls in love with this student half his age after like 20 years of celibacy, and thinks this could work. We could have this relationship, and tries to have it. And it lasts 2 weeks. And he lies to everybody about it because he wanted to pretend like it never happened, you know. Um, and then his whole Sangha finds out, 2 years ago you had this relationship with the student. We didn't know you ordained that person. You ordained somebody that you were sleeping with, you know. And he never quite recovered. I don't think he could ever really accept what happened. You know? And he was smart. He was wise, and he had all the training. He had read all the books about boundaries and professionalism, and it still happened because there was something unaddressed. There was something unaddressed that actually all the training couldn't help with, that the meditation and the monastic life couldn't touch in him. You know, even all the therapy he went to didn't address. Um, and if the story of Buddhism in the US is a story of a lot of problematic teachers. And a lot of them are saying, "Oh, he was so great, and he helped so many people, but he just had this one thing, you know. He was an alcoholic or he was a sexual predator, you know." And what does that tell us about the thoroughness of what this tradition has to offer? It's not a complete path. The complete path is the one that you make for yourself. But nothing works out of the box. Oh, it's all custom, you know. And if you think if I play my Zen cards right, then it's all gonna get sorted, and you don't go to therapy or whatever. You're not receiving the information that's being freely offered to you by your life. And then with the so there we can see that yeah, I see no evidence of there being teachers that are perfectly enlightened beings. And I've been around a lot of them. And there's everyone's got a blind spot. So we can relinquish that idea. So that's the first treasure of the Buddha, the first treasure of the perfect teacher. Sometimes in the ceremonies we say, I take refuge in Buddha, the perfect teacher. It's like, okay, so we don't get to have the perfect teacher. I take refuge in Dharma, the perfect teaching. Is Dharma the perfect teaching? It's very, very multifaceted. There is a lot of different teachings in Buddhism. Some of them are contradicting each other. Some of them uh, are right for one temperament and wrong for another temperament. And sometimes we could live our whole life doing Zen, and we're kind of looking across the aisle, going and be like, I don't know, in Vipassana they're doing this thing, and that looks compelling, you know. Or I'm doing the shikantaza kind of Zen, and I come across somebody that's doing this koan kensho thing, and they're telling me that I've got it all wrong, and I have doubts around that, you know? And and so like when we're talking about Dharma, we're talking which Dharma? What teaching? You know? And then when you look at Buddhist psychology, there's this glaring omission of emotions. Buddhism doesn't talk about emotions. Contemporary Buddhism that you might read in Pema Chodron or Joko Beck might talk about emotions, but historically the tradition kind of doesn't really address it. So there's a shortcoming there. They didn't know what trauma was, you know? You can look at some things and be like, yeah, they could kind of see what trauma was, but not the way we understand it now, you know? So there's a lot of okay, so the perfect teaching is incomplete. You know? I take refuge in Sangha as the perfect life, the perfect community, you know? Um, I've also never experienced a perfect community, you know? You go into a place like a Zen center because something has um, happened to leave you in need, you know? If things were going really, really well for you and you felt perfectly, satisfied and in balance, you wouldn't think, I'm gonna go see what this is, you know? You're coming to see what this is because there's a scratch that needs to get itched here, you know? And if you put a roof over a bunch of people that have a scratch that needs to get itched, they're all different scratches, there's all different needs there, and there's different traumas and different woundings there, you know? And it's not necessarily the family that we would choose, you know? So you don't get the perfect teacher, you don't get the perfect teachings, you don't get the perfect community. Um, so when Buddhism fails you, how do you not fail yourself? I understand that there's a danger in painting in broad strokes like this. But in a tradition that's so full of promoting a myth of itself, I think there's kind of a strong remedy that we could apply, you know? And clearly, I haven't given up on the project of Zen practice, you know? I think that there is something even better than the sugar-coated mythologized version that we're being fed. And there's something true about the mythologized version that we're being fed if we understand how to dance with it. Um, I was talking to somebody recently and they were talking about the kind of feeling intimidated about going to Hokyoji to go to sesshin. Hokyoji is this rural practice center in southern Minnesota. And it's a spot that kind of like a lot of the Midwestern, category lineage places kind of share as a place to do sesshin out of the cities. And he's like, well, if I go, it's gonna be uncomfortable. I'm gonna have to eat in this way. I gotta chant the chants and I gotta, follow the schedule. And it's just like, I don't know if I can do it. And then I thought, well, why don't you go and fail? You know? So there's this, I think subtly, there's this project that we might be involved in where we get to come out on top, you know? And my understanding of the tradition as I've come to appreciate it, which is different for other people, you know. Other people really really think that, the heart of the matter is having this experience of seeing your true nature. The singular experience of seeing your true nature. I think what I've come to value is letting it all be very plain and seeing how rich plain can be. And seeing what self shows up when I'm not trying to construct one to present to people for approval, to present for myself for self-esteem or for gratification or for clout, you know. I'm sitting here thinking, so we have one person that just really doesn't like what I have to say. And they said, see you next weekend. So I'm going to have to come in here, you know, ready to be berated, you know. And part of being a priest is like marking myself for beration, you know. And no, and there's no magic thing happening here where I'm okay, you know. It's not like I love it, you know. It's not like I'm unstained. But there's something about the embracing the practice of non-pretense that makes it a bit more okay, you know. It's like, what am I going to say? What zinger am I going to say to really defend myself? You know, how am I going to just embarrass the person that disagrees with me, you know, in front of everyone so they all know that I'm the good one, you know? It's hopeless, you know. It was an amazing day. I worked at a record store in San Francisco when I was in my 20s, late teens and early 20s. And it was such an amazing day for me when I realized that I could say I didn't know what band people were talking about, you know, because for the first year, it didn't matter if I knew what you were talking about or not. I pretended like I did, you know, because what would happen to me if you knew, if you knew I was a faker, you know, if you knew I didn't know all the bands, you know. Um, so this practice can be a little bit like a tarot card, you know. It might not have its own meaning from its own side that you need to understand, you know, but it begins a certain conversation that you're going to have with yourself. And then you figure out what that is by just staying in dialogue, you know, staying in dialogue and not, you know, sometimes we love this quote by Suzuki Roshi: in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, in the expert's mind, there are few. Experts have lots of possibilities too. I think it's an imperfect phrase, you know, but I think the spirit of what's being said there is like, in a dynamic world, don't stay in any conclusion. Okay, I feel complete.